Thank you, Brenda, and thanks to the city of Portland for inviting me to speak today. I was just saying to Brenda that this is one of my uh, pet projects, really, educating people about invasives and doing my best to work on habitat restoration on our Falmouth Land Trust lands and on my own property. So this is a subject that's very close to my heart. So I'm happy to share what I have learned over the years. And I will try to keep this at a very introductory level. I'm going to try not to get too technical. So, but do feel free to ask questions. I guess at the end we'll have a discussion. So yeah, we can get started. I did just want to give a quick note about our organization in case you're tuning in and you've never heard of a land trust, or you've heard of them, but you don't know what they do. It's a strange name. I'm not a fan of the name land trust per se, but it's what we've got. So we are a conservation land trust. And so we're in the nonprofit world, and we acquire land and conservation easements, and we're really looking to preserve natural areas, waterways. We also have a productive farm, which is used by our partners cultivating community to grow lots of food for the Portland area. And we have a lot of forest, this being Maine, the pine tree state. And we do our best to care for over 2,800 acres. And we've been around for over 40 years. We have lots of smaller properties, being that we're in southern Maine. We didn't have the luxury starting in 1981 of preserving giant chunks of land, but we're doing our best to put acreage back together. We very happy that we now have a 2,000 acre conserved corridor between Falmouth and Windham, which is quite amazing. And past years, maybe that would have been a state park, but that's not in the cards anymore. So we do our best as nonprofit land trusts and municipalities to care for this land. And a lot of our land does have some invasives on it. So this is, a problem that we're dealing with as well. And of course, we have lots of trails. So do feel free, if you've never come out to Falmouth, we've got lots of properties that are easily accessible from Portland. You can even take the bus to a number of them. So I encourage you all to check out our website to learn more. So thank you for that little side note. And so today we're going to talk about some of the more common invasives that you may find in your own backyard. So I'll give a little bit of a background just on the ecology that Brenda alluded to. Yeah, these are cool plants, but they're not in the spots where they evolved, which can cause some issues. And I'll go through 7 very common invasives in our area that are fairly easy to identify, which is important, as we'll talk about. And then we'll talk a little bit about, next steps. If you have successfully remediated the invasives on your property, what else might you want to do? So just to take a step back here for a second and talk about the ecology and the conservation issues that are going on, and why we care about invasives. I just wanted to point out that, here we are in southern Maine, and like most parts of the planet, we're dealing with a lot of issues, a lot of threats to nature in our area: habitat loss, degradation of habitat, fragmentation of habitat, getting it chopped up into smaller pieces. Probably most of we are also experiencing a global biodiversity crisis and loss, and invasives are part of that biodiversity loss. And then, of course, we throw climate change into the mix, and that's really just a threat multiplier. I could give a whole separate talk on the interactions between climate change and invasive species, but I won't get into that today. But just to point out that if it were just invasive species, we might not be as worried, but there's a lot going on, and our forests are in a lot of having a lot of trouble, and invasives can really just exacerbate that. So we've been trying within the land trust to do some remediation and work on habitat restoration. And what we're finding sometimes is that even if we get something more under control in our preserve, maybe the surrounding landowners, and in a lot of cases we have backyards that directly abut our properties, And so if those backyards are full of invasive plants, it's very hard for us to keep them out of our conserved land. So we really are trying to get the word out to landowners to help out the nature around you by dealing with what's in your own backyard, really. So, and just another quick note on the ecology of all of this. Again, we are trying to manage mostly forests, but some other habitats as well for wildlife and for other benefits that we can get from these conserved areas. But invasives make it difficult to do that. So here I just pulled together a little example. We've got our yellow warbler there, and this yellow warbler, that's its migration map, and it's here with us now in that salmon color. You can see Maine, and that's its summer habitat. So it's coming up here. In the winter it's down there in the blue area in South America, Central America. Some of them hang out year round in Florida and Texas, places like that. But this time of year, the warblers are amazing. We have this amazing opportunity to see these little colored jewels of birds who come to Maine. And the reason they come here is to find insects to feed their babies. So when they see a forest floor that's covered in invasive honeysuckle, those invasive honeysuckles don't have any insects for them to feed their young birds. So that's why this is a problem, from an ecological perspective, is that our native plants, and Doug Talamy, if any of you have read him, has done a fantastic job of explaining this. And I could give you a book reference at the end of explaining that our native plants are hosting hundreds of species of caterpillars, these soft-bodied, critters that are wonderful baby bird food. And when our birds come back and they find a lot of invasive plants, it's kind of like a food desert to them. They can't find enough food to raise their young. So that's just sort of one example of why we're concerned about this, and why we find it is important to try to do habitat restoration, remove the number of invasives, and increase the number of natives. And just want to take a quick aside here. All of the plants I'm going to be talking about today are from Eurasia originally. They're mainly introduced into Maine in the 1800s. And I think you can see from this map why that is. We're at the same latitude. We have the same seasons. When it's winter in Maine, it's also winter in Eurasia. And so you tend to find that a lot of the plants we see here are originally from Eurasia. We don't have as many invasives going north-south. Not that it doesn't happen, but we have a lot that travel east-west. And I think some of this goes back to kind of Victorian times and a fascination that English people had with Eurasian plants, and wanting to have one of everything in their own gardens from all around the world. And we didn't know at the time that was going to cause problems, that some of these plants were going to quote unquote behave well and stay in our backyard only, but others were going to escape into the more natural areas. And because they didn't evolve here, and they didn't bring most of the time they came by themselves, they weren't brought with all of their pests, all the insects that eat them. So again, they don't provide that food source for native wildlife. And generally speaking, that's why we're interested in them. That these plants that are wonderful. If you want to go visit them in Eurasia, great, lovely, but they're kept in check there by millions of years of evolution and all these relationships that they have there with their own predators and diseases that they've been able to escape from, because we humans have transplanted them to areas where they did not evolve. So, not the fault of the plant. Okay, so today we're trying to focus on what you can do. And most of my talk here will be talking about our own backyards. And again, to that point of how can we reduce those stressors? We are lucky in southern Maine that there are still forests nearby, usually. Even in Portland, there are quite large forested areas. So we can reduce those stressors. One way of doing that is to do some habitat restoration on your own property. And I also just want to put in a pitch, in your own city or town, kind of moving up a level and scale. There are groups that will volunteer, and we, Falmouth Land Trust, other land trusts, and I'm sure groups in Portland host volunteer days where people can help physically remove invasives from some of these green spaces, which is also helpful. And then I also just wanted to put in a plug that in Maine, if you can advocate for additional invasives resources, I feel like this is not something that's getting a lot of attention at the state level compared to other states. For example, in the state of New York, they have a real estate transfer tax, which raises millions of dollars that goes into invasives remediation. And we just don't have anything like that in Maine yet. So we're really scrambling for the resources to adequately address this issue. There is a bill in the legislature right now that would start to address this. So if you feel like advocating for this with your representatives, you're welcome to. So yeah, there are many things that you can do. But today we're going to focus on these 7 that you might have in your own yard. And some of these you or a previous homeowner may have planted because it was pretty. I mean, burning bush is a very, very popular plant. People were planting up until recently. You can no longer buy it in Maine. Same goes for barberry. You see that a lot still planted as part of people's lawns and also at gas stations and, more shopping centers, that kind of thing. Some of these others, and multiflora rose is another one that was sort of a pretty flower. And then others kind of were thought to be pretty by some folks and have now really spread. So we're going to start with these 7. These are not the only invasive plants in Maine by any stretch, but these are the 7 that I have encountered a lot in this area. And I will point out that we had an intern a couple of summers ago who made a very nice webpage for us, series of web pages, which is referenced there, where you can find most of this information. Okay, so the first thing you want to do if you're looking at your yard is figure out do you have any of these, and it's very important to correctly identify these things because if it isn't a native plant that's providing lots of great habitat, you don't want to accidentally remove that. So I'm focusing today just on the really defining characteristics that hopefully will pop out at you, even if you don't know a lot about botany and plants per se. So we'll start here with burning bush. Easiest way to identify this is in the fall. If you have a shrub in your yard that just turns almost uniformly this bright pink reddish color, that's probably burning bush. But to me, the most identifiable characteristic here are these quote unquote corky wings. So you can see that in both of these pictures, but even in the summer where it's still green, that picture on the right there, you can see these bits. It almost looks like it was wrapped and now the wrapping is coming off. They're called corky wings. They sort of stick out on either side of the stem there. And that is the only plant that you can find in Maine that looks like that. So that's, again, because it's not, didn't evolve here. There aren't other similar native plants that look like it. So I find that's pretty indicative that you've got burning bush. So that's one to keep an eye out for. Another one is we have a few invasive honeysuckle species. And this is slightly trickier because we do have native honeysuckles. So first you want to figure out, is this even a honeysuckle? And the natives and the invasives look somewhat similar to the untrained eye. So you want to look for, lots of these small leaves, and they have very small, delicate, flowers. And then after that, they have these paired red berries. So, if you're starting to think, yeah, I think this is a honeysuckle, I just don't know whether it's native or invasive. It's very shrubby. It'll have lots of stems. Doesn't get too tall. It's not a tree. It's somewhat similar to burning bush in that shape, kind of just a big, maybe it gets as tall as you, but that's about it. Okay, so you think you've identified that it is a honeysuckle of some kind. Then to figure out if it is a native or invasive, you would want to pick a stem that's, about as big as your pinky finger or pencil, and take some sharp shears and make a cut and cut off a piece of that. And you can see here in the picture that if it's got that darker pith, and sometimes you can see that there's a little hole there. It's called hollow pith. Then you know that you've got an invasive honeysuckle, and that's one that you should probably try to remove. If it's solid white pith, it's a native honeysuckle, and you leave it alone and be very happy that it's in your yard. It's providing lots of good insect habitat. Another one that was planted because it has these very pretty flowers, as you can see, is multiflora rose. And so this has a very typical rose appearance. If you're familiar with roses, it's got those thorns, it's got, lots of little leaflets there. The way to tell it apart from our native rose, which is the Virginia rose down there in the corner, is that it has white flowers, and those are about to appear. So this is a good time of year to be keeping an eye out for multiflora rose. If you've got this, again, this is very bushy, shrubby, lots of stems. And if you see just a profusion of these small white flowers on what looks like a rose, that's multiflora rose. Later in the season, when it has the little rose hips, the little fruits, you can see there that they're very small, lots of little tiny rose hips. Some of you might be familiar with beach rose or Ragusa rose. That is also an introduced species. It's not as invasive, it's not as aggressive. That has a giant rose hip, and multiflora rose has a very, very small rose hip. And Virginia rose, our native, kind of falls in between. It has, pink flowers, darker stems generally, and a medium rose hip. The one thing I will point out is that some guidebooks will tell you to look for the green stems on the multiflora, but I found that it can trick you and start to look a little bit more like a Virginia rose if it gets sunburned. Those stems will turn darker and start to look a little bit more like Virginia rose. So yeah, just be aware that there is a native rose. And buckthorn is very, very common. We've got a couple of invasive species here, common and glossy. One of the common is pretty easy to identify. It's got these little spines at the ends of the branch there. You can see in the bottom right. And the common buckthorn, another way to tell is, if you scratch, at least on the younger growth, if you scratch the bark, it's orange underneath. Glossy buckthorn looks pretty similar, but as you can tell from the name, it's got very shiny leaves. To me, the best ID characteristic for this one, because there are a lot of natives that you might get this confused with, not necessarily other buckthorns, but these invasive buckthorns stay green really late into the fall. So when a lot of other things in your yard have lost their leaves or the leaves have turned color, buckthorn is still going strong. It's still green. And that's one of the ways that it has succeeded as an invasive plant, is that it basically has a longer growing season. It evolved elsewhere, and it keeps photosynthesizing longer than other plants. So I find that that's the easiest time to spot it, is kind of late in the fall when, before winter, obviously, but later in the fall when everything else seems like it's going to sleep, and this plant has just still got green leaves, and maybe they're starting to yellow. That's a really good indication. The other thing is they've got these black fruits, at least the females, that are small and clustered, and they'll persist. You'll see those in the middle of winter. So, take your time with buckthorn. Don't just think you know that you've got a buckthorn and start cutting it down. Make sure you feel good that it's definitely a buckthorn. Again, common is easier to ID. Glossies can sometimes be confused with other things. So I'm trying to focus on the bits that really make it stand out as different. Okay, moving on to barberry. We've got a couple of invasive species of barberry. This does not look like anything else in the Maine woods. I find this one is generally pretty easy for people to identify. It's covered in these little spines and lots of these little leaflets of varying sizes. It is a prolific fruit producer. These little tiny berries you can see there on the left, sort of like little red eggs. And for that reason, it is a little bit difficult to remove. It's dropping a lot of seed every year. And I sort of joke that I would like to rename this plant tick bush in Maine, because I think that might get across to people that this is not something you want in your yard. Some scientists studied this, and this plant actually harbors more ticks, partially because they think the birds don't really like to pick ticks off of it because it's so spiny. So definitely, if you don't like ticks, you should be removing barberry. And this spreads pretty easily into forests. You can walk on some of our trails and you'll be in the middle of the forest and suddenly there's a patch of barberry. So we could definitely use help if homeowners could take this one out. And I'm just going to plow through these. We're getting close to the end of this section. We've got bittersweet. And this one, you want to make sure that you're not dealing with the other couple of climbing vines that we do have in Maine, which have completely different leaves. I'll talk about the one that has similar leaves in a minute, but just to make sure you're ruling out Virginia creeper, grape. Those look very different. But this is definitely a very prolific vine all around Portland. So 9 times out of 10, if you're looking at a climbing vine that's climbing up a tree or really taking something over, it's an invasive bittersweet. And these berries persist. Some people find these very pretty. They like to bring them into their house at Thanksgiving. But this is not a great plant for wildlife. And it can actually kill trees. I've seen this happen where if you have a fragmented piece of forest, it gets a lot of sunlight, these bittersweet will choke the tree eventually. I will point out that, and one other thing about it, the roots are orange, so that's also indicative, but I will point out that the native bittersweet also has orange roots. I have never seen native bittersweet in Maine. It is not very common here, but if you want to just double check, the best time to do that is when it's fruiting or when those fruits are noticeable. You can see in the bottom left here, this Asiatic bittersweet will have lots of berries down the stem, whereas the native American bittersweet will just have a few berries at the tips of the vines. So that's one way to double check. But again, I would say almost all of the time in the Portland area, if you see a vine that looks kind of out of control and climbing up a tree or climbing over a fence or climbing up a light pole, it's probably invasive bittersweet. Okay, and last but not least, the knotweed. So some folks call this bamboo because you can see on that picture on the right, below the leaves, it has this very hollow jointed stem, which reminds some people of bamboo. It is not a bamboo, but this is very fast growing. You may notice soon that there are these flowers, these little delicate white flowers. And this is a plant that dies back in the winter. So that's also an indication that you've got knotweed. If you see in the winter, this sort of brown shriveled up knotweed. And, this one is a bit of a special case. So knotweed evolved in an area where there were a lot of volcanic activity. So this plant is quite a wonder of nature where it evolved. it grows on the sides of active volcanoes. And when the lava comes down and covers it and kills it, you can go back 10 years later and there's the knotweed coming up through the cold lava. This thing is indestructible, which again is wonderful where it evolved, but makes it very, very difficult to deal with in Maine and other places where it's been introduced. And because of that tendency to be able to come up through rock, can wreak havoc with people's foundations and walls, stone walls, brick walls. And, in the UK, it's now shown to reduce your property value if you have this on your property near your house. And that's starting to happen in the United States as well. Last year in Massachusetts, a jury awarded a homeowner $186,000 because the developer had not disclosed that there was knotweed on the property. They had kind of beaten it back, and as we know, it will come back unless it's really aggressively dealt with over many, many years. So that's knotweed. And you also see this along roadsides this time of year. Unfortunately, whenever you do roadside cutting, what you're really doing is just chopping it up and spreading those fragments all the way along the road. So you'll see that all over Maine. You'll notice that the next time you travel north too, you'll see these big thickets of this knotweed right along the roads. And it's because of the way that we're cutting and spreading it. All it needs is a tiny fragment to get going. And this can be very destructive along stream corridors. It gets, every time there's a flood, it gets, little pieces of it get carried further downstream, and it can destabilize banks. So especially if you have this near any water body, it would really be great to address it. Okay, so that's kind of the nutshell of the ID. And I will put in a plug for this lovely book that you can get through the Maine Natural Areas Program, the Maine Invasive Plants Field Guide. Because, as you can see, there are more than just 7 in here, but it gives you lots of good info on how to ID these things. Okay, so you've gotten to the point where you're sure that you have one or more of these plants on your property. So now what do you do? Okay, so we're going to leave knotweed aside for the moment. We're just going to talk about the other 6 to start with. I think you're seeing where I'm going with that knotweed is a special case. But for the most part, the other 6 that we just talked about, when they're very small, you can hand pull them. And that is really the best way to get them. You really should try to learn how to identify those 7 plants. And if you see one pop up in your yard, just pull it up immediately. And you can hang that in a branch so that it won't reroot. If it's gone to the stage that it has a lot of fruits on it, it's really best to put that in a plastic bag, unfortunately, and tie it up and dispose of it in the trash so that it doesn't spread. So that works well for very small plants. If you have a larger shrub, you could think about using one of these lever-based tools, which can help you pull these up by the roots. There are a bunch of different brand names: Polar Bear, Weed Wrench, Uprooter, and those can be useful. The only caveat I would give you here is you really need to think about what kind of soil disturbance you'll be doing when you do that, because invasive plants love disturbed soil. They are better able to deal with that. They outcompete native plants usually in a disturbed setting like that. So sometimes you could potentially make the problem worse by ripping up a large shrub if you're just going to leave that soil kind of disturbed. So just be thinking about that. And in that case, if you feel like you may be causing more trouble than good, you could think about cutting back those larger shrubs. And you need to do that repeatedly. You may need to do it in the spring and again in the fall. And you'll need to do it most likely the following year and maybe the year after that. It'll depend. You'll have to kind of keep an eye on things. But what you're doing really is what's called carbohydrate starvation. That plants have, as most of I assume, the upper part of the plant is what's doing the photosynthesis and, creating those starches, those carbohydrates that are then going to go down into the roots and make the root system bigger so that the following year it can grow even more vigorously. So by removing that above ground vegetation, you're not disturbing the soil, but you are, sort of slowly setting that plant back. And you can eventually kill it that way. But it takes persistence. You need to be cutting it back, again, probably at least twice a year and generally for multiple years. So in that case, sometimes it's helpful just to kind of keep track of what you've done, put a little piece of flagging so you can go back to it and catch it and keep at it. And maybe after, a year or 2 or 3 years, you may really have, that may be the end of that plant. So knotweed, as I mentioned, is a sort of special case. If I am hyper vigilant for this in my yard and I have this I don't have it's not a patch, but underneath my deck, there was one plant, one little thing, it was like this big when I first noticed it. And I was able to hand pull the whole thing. So I thought 3 years later, there's another one in the same spot. Pull that, so, and I've managed to keep it under control that way by just whenever I see a new shoot, I take it out. But that is, that's the only time that hand pulling works, is if you're dealing with almost nothing. Otherwise, you're looking at a really dedicated multi-year effort. And I'm not going to go into all of the details here, but again, that's sort of carbohydrate starvation, but it's even trickier with knotweed. You need to do some timed removal of that above ground vegetation. You have to be very careful not to spread it. In some cases, if it's a larger grouping, you need to cover the ground with black plastic, really try to get it back. I've heard of some situations where it's really been allowed to get large, that people have removed the soil, and you really have to go down deep, because again, this thing is able to come up through sides of volcanoes. So, and at that point, if you've got a really large patch, you're probably looking at a professional job. And at that point, as I think this group will talk about at another point, there is a waiver process to be able to use herbicide, because herbicide and physical removal generally works best when you're dealing with knotweed. And there is a process to get a waiver through the city of Portland that I won't go into. So yeah, and here's a picture of it growing through a foundation. So yeah, don't mess with knotweed. And just a quick point that obviously I just covered the main 7 that you might encounter in your backyard. There are many others. If you have a Norway maple in your yard, I would beg you to remove that and plant a native maple. Here is a Crimson King on the right. That's what it looks like the first, when you buy a Crimson King and you plant it in your yard, it looks that beautiful purple, but it's all the seeds it produces and spreads all around end up being green trees. I was in Camden a couple of years ago and was trying to find a native maple in the town and in the parks and things. I could not find one. I kept going up to all these green maples, and they were all Norway maples that had spread from people planting these very pretty Crimson King Norway maples. And again, local insects cannot eat these. They did not evolve to handle the toxins in the Norway maple leaves. All plants and insects are kind of, having this war with each other, and the plant doesn't want to be eaten, and the insects want to eat. So it's a tight evolutionary bond there. So these Norway maples are, again, food deserts for wildlife. The one in the middle there is black swallowwort. Definitely keep an eye out for that. We have it on one of our land trust properties. It's very difficult to deal with. So it's not widespread in Maine yet. So if you see something with these shiny slightly heart-shaped leaves and seed pods in the late summer, that would be something to think about as well. Taking out, there's garlic mustard there on the left. This one, at least you can eat. It's quite invasive, but also very tasty. So plenty of other invasive plants out there. I just wanted to start with the most common ones in the area. But if you get really into this, you can go far. It may depress you when you first start to realize how many of the plants you see around you are actually not very useful to the wildlife around you. Okay, so let's say you have gotten things under control in your yard. It's taken you, probably at least, a couple years. You want to keep staying vigilant for regrowth or for new invasive plants. And you might want to think about planting some native plants, help to take up that space, because invasives, like, nature abhors a vacuum. Invasives will come into disturbed sites. So if you want to find natives, I'm finding that local greenhouses are getting better at it. They sometimes try to list, what's native. You have to be a little careful with your local greenhouses, because they will often be selling cultivars that are not super local, but certainly better than some of these very invasive plants. And often you can order things if they don't have them at the greenhouse. I also encourage folks to check out the native plant sales that are going on all over the state. Audubon does one, and actually they now have more of a store and an order system too, in addition to just a one-day plant sale. Wild Seed Project is another good source. And, and also you can DIY this to a degree. I really don't encourage you to just go try to dig up native plants and move them, because that can be very problematic and difficult to get them to survive. But acorns, if you have space for an oak, oaks are fantastic that hosts for caterpillars. And just warn you there, obviously think carefully about planting trees. They take up a lot of space. They get very big, and you don't want them too close to your foundation or your roof either. So make sure you've got those at least 50 feet away. Okay, so before I take questions, just want to point out a couple of resources here. If you are looking for what you can plant instead of an invasive plant or an introduced plant, Maine Audubon's got a great guide online, their native plant finder. And again, this book, that's the title of it, the Invasive Plants Field Guide. And also recommend this book, which is Casco Bay Invasive Species Network's Winning the War on Weeds. And again, the Wild Seed Project website has lots of information. And Doug Talamy is a fantastic resource. If you haven't read Nature's Best Hope, I highly recommend that book. And he actually started Homegrown National Park program, which is trying to get folks to realize that, if enough homeowners converted their lawns into native plantings, that it could be like having a new national park. So there's a lot that can be done. So yeah, so with that, I guess I can open it up to questions or discussion. I don't know, Brenda, how you want to handle that.
Yeah, feel free to either come off mute and ask questions, or if you want to raise your hand, and we'll also call on people.
I'll jump in with a question if you don't mind, Brenda.
Yeah.
So very great, very informative presentation, Mila. Can you maybe tell us about some success stories you've had at the Land Trust with some of the removal efforts you've undertaken?
Yeah, we, and full disclosure, we do a combination of herbicide use, very, very targeted, cut stem application only in the fall. And we do that in conjunction with these physical removal procedures. We've had luck with doing some physical removal in the spring and then following up with some very, very targeted herbicide application in the fall. But so just with that caveat, yeah, I mean, our issue is that we have tried to be very strategic about it. We cannot treat all 2,800 acres at once. We just know that that's not feasible. So we have targeted a couple of our properties, and this may sound counterintuitive. We've targeted properties that don't have a huge invasive species problem for the most part, because with limited resources, it's best to start where you can get things under control. And I should have mentioned earlier, if you do have a larger property and you have a larger patch even, you should work from the outside in. go for where it's less common and into where it's more concentrated. So we focused on a couple of properties. And it's been really gratifying to see, we removed a lot of bush honeysuckle from one of our forest preserves. And it's been lovely to see the ferns come back, and that it's in that case, there were enough ferns left that they were able to quickly come into that space when the invasives were removed. So that's been nice to see. We have another property that used to be a farm, and because of that, it has a meadow and a forest. So that's edge habitat. So that is just, the invasives have a field day there. We have a lot of bittersweet and a lot of barberry and a lot of multiflora. But it's a small property, it's 25 acres. And we have willing school students who come and help us with that. So it's been fantastic. With our lovely education and outreach coordinator had the entire 8th grade of the Falmouth Middle School out there last fall, and they were removing invasives and they're planting natives. And we've been doing that, and they're going to do it again this year. And before that, we had staff and volunteers doing it. So, making that multi-year effort really does pay off. When I first looked at that property, I thought, wow, I don't know if we're going to be able to wrest this away from the invasives, but with concerted effort over many years, we are seeing a difference. And it's been fun in that way because we're also trying to be climate smart about the native plants that we're putting in there. We're trying to plant natives that are at the northern edge of their range right now because their ranges are moving north. So, and we're increasing the biodiversity of the forest, because the other thing that we're dealing with in southern Maine is all of our forests, well, most of Maine really, are cut over. They're not as biodiverse as they were in the past. So we're able to, add in some viburnums and, other kinds of shrubby species that should have been there but weren't. And the invasives came in the meantime. So we're trying to change that balance over. So we've had some good luck there. And then we also have a preserve next to our school campus. And, so you're noticing a theme here: use child labor to help you with invasive plant management. Just kidding. But they actually love it. It's a great activity for kids to do, because they feel like they're really making a difference. They're helping the birds, they're helping the insects, and it's a great way to get their energy out, And so, again, and also just having that concerted effort over multiple years can really help to get things back under control. So yeah, those are, but again, those are just 3 of our properties. We're not trying this everywhere because we just do not have the resources. So I definitely encourage you all to be strategic. And even if it's just your own yard, figure out like, what can you reasonably do where you're not going to lose hope and feel defeated? What can you commit to doing and that you can stick with? It's important, because this can feel overwhelming sometimes. It's a great question.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that people lose sight of a lot of times, is that it does take many years of persistence to do it, because a lot of these plants are difficult to move out of your yard. So I think that's the key part, is like keep at it, and incremental improvement, I guess.
Exactly.
Had a couple other questions, but first, does anybody else have any that they would like to ask?
I can jump in with a question. Thank you for this. It's been super informative. I have many of these invasives in my yard, and have been, sort of doing different things to like fight them back for the last couple of years. So this is like my 3rd summer battling the knotweed in my yard, and it's and basically what I've been doing is just trying to sap it of carbohydrates, as you mentioned. So pulling small shoots and then just periodically like breaking down all of the larger shoots, and then just piling them and making sure that they're not spreading, piling them on like some thick plastic on my gravel driveway. And they've just been like slowly decomposing there. So I don't know if that's the best way to be doing that, but it doesn't seem to be spreading from there. So I feel like that's under control. Anyway, but my neighbors have, lots of knotweed, and that's not being controlled in any way. So I don't know if you have advice. I don't really know if I'm going to take the next plunge to trying something bigger, right? To bring in a professional perhaps. But when there are sort of multiple properties that are all next to each other and maybe sharing some knotweed between them, I don't know if you have advice or any examples of times that folks have come together to sort of work on that common problem.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, like I said, we have that issue because we are an abutting landowner to people who have these things in their yards, and we're trying to deal with them in our forest next door to them. So yeah, we do try to do some general education, but yeah, it can be a little intimidating to try to educate a neighbor. I feel like with knotweed, sometimes it's easier for people to grasp the danger to their property. The knotweed is really in a special case in that it will threaten your foundation. It will grow through your sidewalks. It will grow through your driveway. It doesn't mind these concrete and brick and pavement surfaces. So sometimes when people understand that, and there is an article online that's I think from 2 years ago or so, from England, I think, where it was sort of laying out what an issue it is there and how it's gotten to the point where if you have it on your property value goes down. And I mentioned that case from just last year in Massachusetts. So I think we're going to start to see that here as well. So I think that angle may find some traction. Even if people don't really understand or care about plants or insects or nature, they may want to protect their foundation and may want to address knotweed for that reason. Because knotweed, the bigger the patch gets, the harder it is to ever eradicate it. So yeah, I guess just approaching people with out of a neighborly education, non-confrontational, you might have some luck with that. Just say, hey, I don't know if you knew this, but this particular plant actually can cause a danger to our foundations, and maybe we should all come together to deal with this.
That's great. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Good luck.
Thanks.
Any other questions people have?
Not to belabor the point about knotweed, but has there been any experimentation done with planting native tree species in a knotweed stand in order to compete with the knot? Is there anything strong enough in regard to competing with a knotweed stand?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with any particular research studies on that. I mean, I know that it forms a very dense rhizomatous mass underground. So I think my guess is it would be very difficult for something else to get established in an actively growing knotweed patch. So yeah, my guess would be is you really need to try to do that carbohydrate starvation, get it on a multi-year reduction plan before you would try to plant other things in and amongst it.
Yeah, one thing that came to mind is like, and I don't know, maybe this is another invasive tree species, is like black walnut that has toxins in the plant itself, right? That competes with other plants around it. But maybe black walnut is something I'm not aware of that you don't want to plant in Maine. So
I mean, walnut is native. Yeah, I don't really know. Again, because they evolved and on different continents, it's quite possible that even though that is called allelopathy, right, where one tree inhibits the growth of other species, I don't know if that would work on a plant that's from Eurasia. I don't know. It's an interesting thought.
Okay, thank you very much.
And then if anybody didn't have more questions, I was also just curious if you've removed a bunch of plants and you're concerned about maybe erosion, like especially on hillsides or anything like that, if there's anything you want to be mindful of or that you can do to kind of limit some of that like soil loss.
Yeah, that's a great point. When you're dealing with slopes or if you're near water, yeah, you really want to be careful about that, and you might need to employ, other bank stabilization techniques, and maybe use well, hay bales that don't have any weed seeds in them. You don't want to make the problem worse. But yeah, you might need to think about ways to stabilize areas while you're doing this kind of treatment. That's a great point. And I believe the soil and water conservation districts have information about that kind of stream bank erosion control. But yeah, that's a good point.
Cool, thank you. Um, any other questions people have? My only other one, I don't know if we even have time to get into it, but you mentioned that knotweed is really tricky with how often you would have to cut it and that kind of thing. And I was curious if you'd be willing to go into a little bit more detail on that kind of thing.
Sure. I'm going to pull up this handy, at the back of this book, they have a calendar. And it has a rather unfortunate name. It's called the Calendar of Death. But let me see what they have to say more specifically about Japanese knotweed. So they're saying, and actually it's very good timing. It's mid to late June where you'd want to cut the plant back to ground level. And again, you just need to be very careful about the fragments, because those fragments, just a little piece of it, it doesn't need to, can take root. So just be very, very careful about that. And then, you would kind of repeatedly do that after resprouting. So that's going to be throughout the season. Just be keeping an eye on it. Every time it sends up new material, you're cutting it back. And of course, the note is to follow up for 5 to 6 years doing that. So definitely, go into it for the long haul. Understand that it's not going to be an easy fix. But yeah, that's what is recommended. So you can start today.
Could you share what that book is that you're looking at again?
Sure, yeah, and it's actually right here, the third one on my list here, Casco Bay Invasive Species Network. It's called Winning the War on Weeds. A guide to invasive plant management.
Thank you.
That's from 2016, but I believe we have a link to it on our website. So you can get a digital copy.
Have you tried like smothering techniques, Mila? I know in the New Hampshire Department of Ag has done some work. They seem to feel that smothering is probably the for a non-pesticide application, long-term smothering is probably the most effective treatment for patches.
Yeah. So going back to our knotweed slide here, putting the black plastic down on the ground. But again, this is multi-use.
Years.
Yeah.
I think that I was reading an experiment that one of the staff at the New Hampshire Department of Agriculture had done, and it was more than 5 years, I believe, that they had to leave the tarps covered, and you have to maintain them too to make sure that there aren't any poking up here and there once in a while too. But that does seem, again, patience is required.
Yeah, certainly And a combination of techniques with knotweed seems to be most effective. But yeah, it's a tricky one. So definitely try to tackle it when it's a smaller problem than a bigger problem. That's the biggest piece of advice.
Well, if no one has any other questions, Mila, thank you so much. This was exactly what we were looking for, and it's been incredibly helpful information. Thank you to everybody who's come and participated. We will send out a follow-up email, and that will have some more resources and links if people want to do some further reading. And yeah, give you back the rest of your afternoon. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. And if you want to be a habitat hero with the Falmouth Land Trust, we would be happy to have your help with removing invasives. Just our email is on our website. It's just info@falmouthlandtrust.org. Happy to put you on our Habitat Hero volunteer list.
Yeah, we can definitely include that information.
Thank you so much for hosting this.
Thank you.